Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, have created and ruled the Plantagenet Empire, the most dynamic, wealthiest, and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. But the Plantagenets are rarely at peace, and Henry's temper and ego has long troubled his family and his people, from the shocking martyrdom of Thomas Becket to the vicious Great Rebellion that saw Eleanor sent to prison for 15 years. Meanwhile, their brilliant, avaricious, rebellious children have grown, fought, ruled, married, and even died, so that of his 5 sons, only 2 survive, Richard Lionheart and John Lackland. Now, as the 12th century enters its final decade, Henry himself dies, leaving his great legacy poised at the edge of great success or great failure. Here's the story of what happens as Richard and John take their turns on the Plantagenet throne.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story. An epic true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 3, Episode 7. Molten seas, warm blue skies, a shimmering valley all ablaze. When not immersed in talks with overawed Tancred, Richard passed the time dealing with governance issues and shopping for things like the unusually tough local granite that seemed created by God himself to survive the stresses of being catapulted into a fortified wall. He entertained the occasional visitor, one of whom was a Cistercian mystic called Joachim of Fiore, believed to have unraveled the secrets of the Bible, especially the Book of Revelation. Joachim accordingly claimed to understand the timeless swirl of history, a truly noteworthy skill which encouraged him to make confident assessments of the future. The monk was a crusade cheerleader, identifying Saladin as one of history's great persecutors of Christ, while assuring Richard that the Lord will give you victory over his enemies and will exalt your name above all the princes of the earth. Philip Augustus may have felt he was condemned to slog through what must have seemed an eternity stuck in Sicily, but Richard was having a wonderful time. As for Richard's marriage to long-suffering Princess Alice, delayed for decades, that too was about to gain momentum as 1190 ebbed, if not in a direction that inspired renewed love between the Plantagenets and the Capets. Alice, Philip Augustus's half-sister, 30 years old by now, had spent all but the first 8 years of her life stuck on the sidelines, waiting for Richard to marry her. This sad story has never been fully explained, especially since there was an era when noble children married with fair regularity, whether they wanted to or not. Nothing really can account for Henry's neglecting Richard's youthful wedding when he'd married off both young Henry and Geoffrey as boys. The old chestnut that Richard was homosexual, with no interest in marriage to anyone, might be used to explain the bachelorhood of the adult Richard, in control of his own life, but does nothing to address the years before. Other theories have been advanced, ranging from Eleanor's disdain for Louis Capet, her former husband and Alice's father, to Richard's growing estrangement from Alice's brother, Philip Augustus. The more likely reason probably was the belief, widespread at the time, that Alice had been turned into another of Henry's mistresses. The affair had to have begun when she was little more than a dependent girl, while her middle-aged lover was one of the most powerful men on the planet. Today, our sympathies would lie with the poor princess. But she had the bad luck to live in a time when the female, by definition, was blamed for sexual misconduct, even if she was a virginal girl and the man an experienced seducer. Not even the church would help her. The gossip about her was accepted without so much as a murmured dissent in Rome. She was Henry's concubine, or so everyone said, and the Pope certainly wouldn't insist that the wronged son married the soiled woman. As for Richard, if we assume the lady's lurid misfortune was indeed the reason for his adamant determination not to marry her, he evidently felt no remorse. This most unwilling fiancé wanted out. Historian Frank McLynn maintains that Richard asked Philip to consider rescinding the proposed marriage as they waited out the winter of 1190 in Sicily. Yet another reason the relationship between Richard and Philip continued to sour. It happened that another lady, bearing the regal name Berengaria of Navarre, had achieved dominance in Richard's life. A contemporary guidebook for pilgrims, many of whom crossed Navarre en route to Compostela, went on and on about what other pigs the Navarrese were, reportedly prone to nudity, bestiality, and bad table manners. It would therefore be delightful to have some glimpse of the princess, given that Berengaria, about whom we know very little, somehow accomplished what no one else had. She actually caused Richard Lionheart to offer for her hand. There are stories that Richard had met Berengaria at a tournament years before, Lionheart uncharacteristically charmed by the lady. One Berengaria biographer, Marin Mitchell, claims that Eleanor herself had long encouraged this marriage, and that Richard, ignoring his father's maneuvering on the subject of marriage to Alice of France, had exchanged promises with Berengaria's father, the King of Navarre, as far back as the 1180s. The princess's dowry of Navarre was certainly a credible motivator. The little Iberian country was enjoying an ascendancy it would never see again. Navarre guarded major pilgrimage routes from Europe to Compostela, but more to the point, it was in a position to keep pressure on its neighbor to the east, that old Plantagenet and Aquitanian headache, Toulouse. The Plantagenets had dreamed of checkmating that rival for years. Henry himself had tried more than once to find a bride for Richard from the great families in that part of the world, but, atypically, he'd failed. By Richard's day, Count Raymond of Toulouse was one of the few who'd shrugged off the Pope's call to crusade. His disinterest might be attributed to age. While he was only in his 50s, he would be considered elderly for a soldier even in our day. So Raymond had decided he would not be going on crusade. Thus, while everyone else was in Anatolia, Raymond would be right where he had always been, taking sightings along the Aquitane's borders. Where could a Plantagenet turn for support? In short, the well-positioned King of Navarre had a marriageable daughter. Richard accordingly had high appreciation for the value of Navarre, while Navarre could certainly benefit from a close relationship with the greatest king in Europe. Eleanor of Aquitaine now had the opportunity for another dramatic adventure. Survival of 2 royal marriages, a crusade, 10 childbeds, the deaths of half her children, inter-family rebellion, probable treason, 15 years of imprisonment, Rosamund Clifford, Alice of France, and so much rich scandal that people would still be mining it for salacious stories centuries after she died. The Dowager Queen, now in her mid-60s, traveled for months in the winter of 1189 to 1190 to escort the Navarrese princess from Spain to Sicily. The 4-month trip wound from Plantagenet, France, west to Navarre, back toward France, then south along the entirety of the Italian coast from Genoa to Rome to Naples, past Naples, then a sea crossing from the toe of the Italian boot to Sicily, where at last Eleanor could have the pleasure of her adored son's presence for a few days. After 15 years spent making a small circuit of the same few places, it must have been as exhilarating as it was arduous. Back in the world again. Eleanor and Berengaria would spend week after week together on mountain roads, in the Pyrenees, in the startling vertical reaches of the Western Alps and the Apennines, by horseback, muleback, litter and cart, breathing air that snapped with frost, and shading their eyes from the sunrise glitter of sunlight on night-fallen snow. It was tough travel that must have reminded Eleanor of her days in Anatolia. There's a lovely legend that as they faced winter in the mountains, the women wrapped themselves in the sheepskin coats that were a specialty of the Navarrese, lavishly embroidered and comfortingly warm. Given the timing of this adventure in the Alps, Eleanor obviously knew to set out from home before Richard had gained his release from the old pledge to Alice. One does wonder if Eleanor was smiling to herself as she headed off into the mountains of Europe to fetch the real bride, knowing how that impending wedding would cause the thwarted Capets to fume. Richard ultimately bought his escape from the French betrothal by handing 10,000 gold pieces to the humiliated, if now wealthier, French in the spring of 1191. The money had come from their host, King Tancred. Rather anxious to get his port city of Messina back, he bailed it out of English hands by ordering 40,000 golden Sicilian coins hauled to Richard's camp. As for Tancred, quite a bit poorer than he had been just a year before, he was no doubt delighted that the arrival of the two royal women, accompanied by the breezes of spring, signaled the end of his domineering crusader visitors. It was time for everyone to go their separate ways. The Crusaders were bound for Acre, just ending its second winter of siege, Philip in particular anxious to escape the island. And less than a week after arriving, Eleanor headed back to Plantagenet lands with a stop in Rome. Richard was to sail with his widowed sister Joan, leaving the country that had been her home for 13 years, and with his queen-to-be, the Lady Berengaria, still unmarried because the Lenten season postponed the wedding. Philip and the French successfully made it all the way to Tyre on the Syrian coast, but a Good Friday storm scattered the English fleet, more than 200 ships, as it sailed east across the Mediterranean. The storm was bad enough that Berengaria and Joan, along with part of Richard's army, were trapped off the coast of the notoriously uncivilized island of Cyprus. Those of Lionheart's men who clawed their way ashore had to grapple with marauding natives, infamous for robbing pilgrims and holding choice victims for ransom. Other less fortunate people drowned, including Richard's vice-chancellor, whose corpse ultimately washed up on the Cypriot coast, the Great Seal of England still chained around his neck. Richard himself ended up some 250 miles away on the island of Rhodes, as the storm rumbled and thundered off across the Molten Sea. Rhodes thus became the launching pad for Lionheart's memorable descent upon Cyprus. Cyprus held a great deal of innate appeal, namely its strategic location between Italy's ports and Syria's coast. In good weather, you could make it from Cypriot beaches to the Holy Land in a day. Equally valuable, it produced grain and olive oil. It's not at all hard to speculate that Lionheart had his eye on the island long before a sea storm threw some ships off course. Bound to rescue his fiancée, his sister, and his captured men, Richard faced Cyprus's rather awful emperor, Isaac Comnenus, who had basically stolen the monarchy and was reputedly a violent sadist with particular interests in robbery and rape to boot. One clearly appalled chronicler described him as more evil than Judas. As usual, local resistance to the greatest warrior in Europe was insufficient to the task. Isaac summarily bottled up, Richard gave Berengaria and entourage a week to prepare for her wedding and coronation as Queen of England. The couple married in early May 1191, under Cyprus's warm blue skies and sea's sparkling light. Despite very short notice, the event apparently was worthy of a Plantagenet. with feasting and as much opulence as could be brought to bear under the circumstances. 4 bishops officiated. The groom's attire of golden spurs, golden cloak, scarlet hat, and rose tunic studded with silver crescents very probably outshone the bride. Richard was 33, Berengaria 3 years younger, an obscure princess who had just become the crowned queen of England. They would be husband and wife for 8 years, most of which they spent in different countries, never blessed with children. The marriage is another Lionheart mystery. Berengaria's childlessness is often offered as proof that Richard was homosexual. Marin Mitchell, a Berengaria biographer, writes that it's still the belief of many that Berengaria died a virgin. However, even Mitchell quotes a competing story that Berengaria had a miscarriage in Syria, and no chronicler noted anything particularly amiss with the couple, even as Philip Augustus's marital woes got plenty of attention. Nor did Richard set his lady aside, the common solution to the irritating problem of a superfluous wife. Objectively, Berengaria's inability to have a child could well have been nothing but sheer bad luck. She was no longer necessarily at the peak of her fertility. Richard was known to suffer from chronic ill health that many feared had aged him prematurely. They would be separated during much of their relatively brief marriage, and one can't forget that in their first married years, Berengaria shared a crusader's life. Even her physically vigorous mother-in-law, a young woman at the time, had seen no baby born of her days in Anatolia. There probably was no proper honeymoon. Learning that Emperor Isaac had run to one of his fortresses to gather his wits and whatever supporters he could drum up, Richard had the bit in his teeth to teach the Cypriots a lesson. Even a direct appeal from Philip Augustus, waiting impatiently outside Acre for some help with the crusade, didn't redirect Lionheart's energies. Richard displayed his typical skill as a general, gaining control of the entire island by the end of the month, and capturing Isaac's young daughter. Legend says that Isaac, thoroughly done once his beloved daughter was taken, gave up. The former emperor was held in chains forged of silver, Richard having promised that he wouldn't clamp such a lordly person into mere irons. Richard then went about converting the kingdom of Cyprus to cash. After slapping the unfortunate Cypriots with massive taxes, he offered the whole place to the Knights Templar for another 100,000 gold pieces. The Templars, once known for their homespun poverty, had become rich enough to agree to buy it, but the deal never really took. The resentful natives became so threatening that the outnumbered Templars had to depart rather soon after arriving, and never paid more than a fraction of the purchase price. Guy of Lusignan, the ousted king of Jerusalem, had taken time from the siege of Acre to serve as a key supporting player in Richard's conquest of the rowdy island. When the Templars hastily left, he got the place. He never settled the debt either. It was one of the few times a conquest of Lionheart's didn't pay off. The other, still in his future, would be the day he did nothing to stop his men from stripping Leopold of Austria's banner from the walls of Acre. The small wars of Sicily and Cyprus behind him, Lionheart could at last turn his attention to the great war he had been pledged to fight for years by now, the crusade to retake Jerusalem. Richard claimed to be eager to reach the Holy Land, fretting from Cyprus that he hoped to God Acre wasn't conquered before he got there. But the Good Friday storm and his efforts in Cyprus meant that he didn't land on Acre's beach until June 1191, 2 months after the French. He was splendidly accompanied by a retinue of 25 transports, filled to the gunwales with men, horses, money, and supplies, including state-of-the-art siege machines with a range that kept them well back from possible counterattack, and a magnificent Cypriot-bred stallion named Fauvel, admired for its speed, flashy looks, remarkable stamina, and former owner, reportedly Isaac Comnenus himself. Richard was greeted as an epic hero would expect. Compared by swooning poets to the mythic champions of the Trojan War, Lionheart strode the beach to shouts, cheers, bells, and trumpets, fine songs, and so many fires and candles that it was said it seemed the whole valley was ablaze. Some eager crusaders swam out to his ship to meet him. Philip Augustus walked across the sand to welcome his fellow monarch and once dear friend. Even the Muslims knew who this European was, famous as an incomparable warrior, equally famous for his prodigious wealth. His mere presence in Acre dampened Saracen morale. One advisor to Saladin dourly recalling that Richard's arrival had a frightening and depressing impact on the hearts of the Muslims. Philip Augustus had already been in Acre for 2 months. The French were in a generally sour frame of mind. Philip's wife had died in childbirth, along with the newborn twin princes who lived less than a week. The French succession continued to rest uncomfortably on the tiny shoulders of a 2-year-old boy, Philip's only living son. The French Princess Alice, his half-sister, had been rejected, and this after her honor had been thoroughly sullied, first by the abominable Henry Plantagenet, and then by his cold-hearted son. Then there was the episode with the French king's hawk, which shook everyone. Hunting birds had been forbidden on this crusade, but kings lived to shrug off the rules that applied to other people. So Philip had brought a spectacular white falcon, known to be his pride and joy. The bird perversely flew off to the walls of Acre and refused all entreaties to come back. And now, arrogant Richard had arrived to cheering ovations, renewing French memories of the long, dispiriting winter endured with him on Sicily. The two kings were soon back to kicking at each other just as they had on the island. They argued over something as trivial as Richard's dislike for a French knight in Philip's entourage named William de Bars. They sparred over Tancred. They clashed over Richard's careless disregard of his chief ally's request for aid in the form of cash and supplies. Then there was the festering insult of Richard having casually ignored French messengers sent to Cyprus, asking him to speed his departure for Acre. If Philip and Richard had ever been lovers, those days were definitely over. At the moment, they could hardly even be described as friends. It's not hard to imagine the bitter taste on French tongues as the Plantagenet king reaped all the thrilled hosannas on Acre's beach in June, even though his French counterpart had been at work on Acre's siege since April. Philip had done his part. He'd beefed up defenses along the Crusaders' line, had new siege machines blasting at Acre's walls, and put archers on duty day and night, keeping Acre's garrison under constant pressure. Renewed efforts to fill the dry moat at the base of Acre's walls with anything from ship timbers to horse and human cadavers had become a macabre race, with Muslims emerging from the city on virtual suicide missions to drag back out what the Crusaders had just heaved in. Philip had also commanded a major assault against the city, described in chronicles as a violent battle, though unfortunately it had been driven back with heavy French losses. In short, Philip Augustus had been duly energetic, but his role was entirely eclipsed by the arrival of the man already thought by many the greatest soldier in the world. Of course, Richard quickly asserted himself as the Crusade's commander-in-chief, thanks to a potent combination of the bigger army, larger purse, and more awe-inspiring reputation. Envy sharpened Philip's irritation, since Richard's wealth meant more Plantagenet foot soldiers, more archers, more knights, more ships, more everything. especially when Richard ostentatiously doubled the going price for mercenaries, who then flocked to his standard. Rather like jostling millionaires docking their yachts at the same arena, Philip Augustus, King of France, found himself hopelessly outclassed. The French camp bristled with ill feeling. Before long, the chronicler Roger of Hoveden said that Philip was heard threatening that he intended to devastate the lands of the King of England as soon as he was able. And in the meantime, little brother John Lackland, left behind at home, was said to be considering an alliance with the French against the insufferably dominating Richard. It was nothing less than treason. It would not end well. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Beckett Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knapp. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction, and so much more. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again December 16th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.